this is Paideia Today, Season 2, Episode 2. I'm Dr. Scott Masson with Dr. Bill Friesen. We're going to talk about the Middle Ages today, which are often referred to as the Dark Ages. And that will be the beginning of our episode. And if we have time later on, we're going to begin the great Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf and some of the basic ideas around that. But I want to start off with a question, Bill, as our resident medievalist here. The Middle Ages and their reference as the Dark Ages, where does this come from? Is this a product of the Enlightenment and its judgment on the Middle Ages, or where do we get this idea?
The idea kind of grows up first and foremost with Petrarch, I suppose. Petrarch's actually the individual who popularized the notion of a Dark Age. He also actually...
So the Italian Renaissance.
That's correct. So we're looking at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, when he popularizes this notion that this age in between, the Middle Ages, is an age of diminishment and cultural loss, a loss of civilization, a loss of a great many things. And in that, during the Renaissance, both during the Italian Renaissance, which of course is somewhat earlier, and the English Renaissance, which is somewhat later, you have this notion which grows into an overwhelming pejorative tone that attaches to basically all the details of the Middle Ages. And having said that, there is actually some basis to this. You and I have discussed in early episodes of the podcast the Great Dark Age that swept away the civilization of the ancient Greeks in the wake of the Trojan War. You have a 400-year period there from approximately 1200 BC to approximately 800 BC, wherein, again, you have a complete loss of both civilization on the one hand and culture on the other hand. And this involves a lot of things. There was actually a loss of the bulk of what we would say constitutes civilization, and to me, more importantly, the bulk of what constitutes culture. Culture isn't entirely wiped out, but it is mostly wiped out, and it leaves the traces and the ghosts of what the greatness that had gone before. And people in the Middle Ages had just enough to know that they had lost something tremendous. And you've got a number of dates here, so I'm not going to give you hard dates. We need dates to kind of figure out the beginning and the end of this period, and we talked about that a little bit previously. But there are a few key dates in the onset of the Great Dark Age as we see it now. One of these dates is 378 AD. This is the Battle of Hadrianople, where the Visigoths famously crush a massive Roman army. This was unthinkable that barbarians would do this. And we don't have time to get into the details of that, but the Roman emperor at the time decided to attack before he got reinforcements and didn't realize that the bulk of the Visigoths were out on horseback, a radical notion that you would fight from horseback at this time.
Yeah.
And while they were attacking the gigantic Visigoth encampment, we think entailing something in the area of 300,000 persons, the Visigothic army showed up behind him, and the emperor, Varus, suffered the first heavy cavalry charge in recorded history. As they crashed into the back of his legions and destroyed the army, they ferreted him. He was hiding in a thatch roof, the emperor, and they ferreted him out and killed him on the spot. And so a lot of people say that this marked the beginning of the end. I don't buy that, but I think it's a factor. And later on in this podcast, we're going to talk about factors that feed into the onset of a dark age. But that is certainly one of the elements. Then you have the even more dramatic sacking of Rome in 410 by, again, the Visigoths under Alaric.
About which Augustine writes in City of God, right?
Correct, exactly. And this was the first time in approximately 800 years Rome had been breached. It had been besieged a number of times before, perhaps most famously by Hannibal, but it had never been taken. The people who had taken it previously were the migrating ancient Celts back in 390 BC. Wow. So you have a huge stretch of time where Rome is untouchable. And this marks the beginning of being very touchable indeed. And they sacked it and destroyed a tremendous amount of what was in Rome itself. And then finally, the third date and the last date I'll mention here is 476 AD, where you have a Germanic warlord, Odoacer, who displaces the last Roman emperor, one Romulus Augustus.
Yeah.
And to mark the end of the Roman Empire, he sends the royal regalia back to the other capital of the Roman Empire at the time, Constantinople. And he says, here, you can have these. We're done with these in the West. Meaning to say your empire out here is finished. So there's many steps, there's many increments that go into this. But there is no doubt that there was a dark age very quickly in the wake of these events. You see a complete financial breakdown. Roman coinage dies out almost everywhere. It's no longer authoritative. A lot of it gets melted down and turned into either jewelry or finery for weapons and things like this. The migration period of the Germanic barbarians, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, are typified oftentimes by being, well, they're barbarians, but the sheer amount of gold and jewels that get bound up in their day-to-day accoutrements, especially around the more aristocratic elements of these barbarians, is simply staggering. It's just over the top, and largely this is being looted from the Romans themselves. And what you see is a trade culture take its place. So it's a bartering culture now. So you'll pay 10 chickens to have that shed built in the back of your place or something like this. But money no longer works. You see trade networks die out almost entirely. Trade becomes very localized. And this is another sort of hallmark feature of the Dark Ages. We can trace relatively accurately maritime trade by the sheer number of shipwrecks, which we can carbon date and things like that. And we know that by about 100 years after 400, let's say around 500 AD, it had dropped in the Mediterranean down to less than 2% of what it had been in 400. It's just gone. It's gone.
Yeah.
The infrastructure breaks down. Again, we can trace this very accurately. We can see that these magnificent Roman roads, which is one of the great wonders of the ancient world, I mean, many of them are still in place.
Oh, I've seen them. They still exist. Yeah.
Yeah, they're amazing. But we know that by about 450, 475, most of them are now overgrown. They're not being used anymore. No one's even traveling on them to a large extent. So those are gone. The schools are gone. Taxation is gone. Governance is gone. Rule of law is gone. All these things are gone. So I've got a little bit of a quotation here. This isn't from, there's one quotation I was looking for earlier from two monks in the 6th century who were sitting in the Roman Forum looking around. And the Roman Forum, if Rome had a central hub, it was Rome, the city of Rome. And if the city of Rome had a central hub, it was the Roman Forum.
Oh,
and
yes.
This had fallen into complete and utter ruin within 100 years again. To the point where the central part of this magnificent forum is known as the Vacino Campo, I believe, which is the field of cattle. So it's a grazing field for cattle, the center of the empire. I couldn't find that quotation. I searched around for it a bit, and doubtless I'll find it a little bit later when it's too late to use for this here. But we have here another one from Dio Chrysostom. He's writing about Euboea, I believe is how it's pronounced, but I'm probably messing that up. You're the Greek expert, so you know better. In any event, he writes an account back to a friend here. At the present moment, even the land just outside the city gates is quite wild and terribly unattractive, as though it were in the depths of a wilderness and not in the suburbs of a great city, while most of the land inside the wall is sown or grazed. It is therefore surprising that orators trump up charges against the industrious peoples of Kypherios in the remote parts of Euboea, and yet hold that the men farming the gymnasium and grazing cattle in the marketplace are doing nothing out of the way. You can doubtless see for yourselves that they have made your gymnasium into a plowed field, so that the Heracles and numerous other statues are hidden by the corn that grows there. And some, those of heroes, and others, those of gods. You see, too, day after day, the sheep belonging to this orator invade the marketplace at dawn and graze about the council chambers and the empty executive buildings. Therefore, when strangers first come to our city, they either laugh at us or they pity us. So that's Chrysostom commenting on the situation.
Interesting. So, I mean, it's a serious decline, and quite a rapid one from what you're saying. I mean, that's interesting in and of itself. So that's a financial and economic ruin. But the cultural ruin, I guess it goes with it. It's part and parcel of it, or is there some other
Yeah, we oftentimes, it's easy to focus on the loss of Roman civilization, ancient civilization, into this particular dark age. And that's usually what commentators talk about. So they talk about the loss of, the ability to make and pour and set concrete, for instance. The Romans perfected that. The Romans built these magnificent aqueducts and very
which still
spectacular
which
things.
still still stand actually again.
Yeah, yeah. And or they'll talk about the loss of, the Justinian Code and the Roman rule of law, which is obviously extremely important, and its rediscovery in the Italian Renaissance is one of the great hallmarks in the evolution of Western law. And so they'll talk about all these things, but what they don't talk about so much is the loss of culture. We've defined culture in earlier podcasts here, but culture, of course, is centrally bound up in this inherited set of values, which is expressed in, amongst other things, law and comportment, what have you, but also in the art of a people. And the Dark Ages saw a tremendous loss of most of this culture. The great books that you and I talk about vanish. I've heard figures as pessimistic as 0.1% of all great literature from the ancient period survives down to us.
So, for example, mentioning your man Petrarch that you referred to, he's the one who rediscovers Homer. I think he came across some Greek merchant of some sort, and sold him copies of this, which he'd obviously read about. I mean, if you have Latin literature, you will have heard references to the great Homer, but nobody had actually seen the texts until Petrarch came upon them. And is that why he referred to these as dark ages? Is that part of the reason?
It, yeah, I think it is a central part of the reason. These people were, in his view, quite benighted. They did not have culture, at least culture in its refined form. Remember, this culture had been built up over centuries and centuries and centuries by the finest thinkers, the finest writers, the finest artists that each generation could come up with. And then they refined and refined and refined. And when they did compose something new, it was done very carefully, and it was done to an extraordinarily high standard. And then it gets refined again. So this, it brings to you things aesthetically, which are simply astounding, but also in terms of the great themes that we come back to, the great conversation you and I talked about. So many threads of the great conversation die out with this dark age. People are not being educated anymore. Literacy is being lost all over the place. The levels of literacy at certain points in the Roman Empire are actually quite high. And they're not restricted necessarily to the upper classes. There are many people of the middle classes, sometimes even of the lower classes, who are quite capable of reading. In fact, when Rome invaded Greece and effectively sacked it, they took slaves in huge numbers, and the Greeks were considered to be better educated and more cultured than the Romans themselves. And so one of the things the Romans immediately exploited, because they were an extremely, in some
Practical.
senses, yeah, they were practical, and they were weirdly humble, and they would exploit whatever was good in the cultures they took over. So from the Germanic peoples, they took the heavy plow, for instance, and they would take divinities. They were continuously adding to their divinities. What they took from the Greeks was their high culture, and the people who were learned amongst the Greeks, who could teach Homer and the Odyssey and all these things. And they brought them back as slaves. So they were slave professors, if you
Yeah,
will. And they
yeah.
put them to the task of educating their children. So it is said oftentimes in the Roman Empire that first Rome conquered the Greeks, and then the Greeks conquered the Romans. And
Yes.
there's this whole vast strand whereby Greek high culture and its literature became extraordinarily venerated in the later Roman Empire.
There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Yes. And so when the Dark Ages comes, this education ceases. The books in which you could find it burn or are lost. The very notion that you would systematically educate people dies out. It's just gone.
Well,
Um,
that really speaks to the idea of cultural appropriation as inherently oppressive then, in a way, because I mean, it's not that there is no colonization, it's not like there is no conquest, but on the other hand, they are actually recognizing the genuine greatness of other cultures where it is superior to their own. I think that's just really interesting, and you just rarely hear that, but
yeah,
it's simply the fact. Those are the facts.
Rome was an extraordinarily acquisitive culture, and we often hear notions that signal that, and they have to be continuously conquering for Roman culture and Roman society to work, and that is true. As soon as they stop expanding, they die. They're like a lot of big companies nowadays. They have to be continued. They're like a shark. They got to move forward. But having said that, they were a very meticulous, pragmatic people, much more so than the ancient Greeks. And so when they encountered something of advantage to them, they would quickly refine their own culture by fusing it into their own,
Yeah.
which is why the Roman Forum was surrounded by temples that belonged to gods that were not originally Roman at all. They come from all over the place. Some of them are coming from Gaul, others from Iberia.
Yeah, if you
Others
go into the
from,
Pantheon, you can see that they're all around the building. It still stands.
yeah, of course, when it comes to our conversation here with this podcast, it is high culture and literature that they are appropriating, and that then, of course, they refine in their own senses. But the Romans are quite clear about this. Even towards the very end of the Roman Empire, with a few notable exceptions, they're of the opinion that that Greek culture is superior to theirs. It's just of a higher order.
And nonetheless, when the Romans are effectively destroyed by the Goths, the Visigoths, something allows that culture to be preserved. However, in whatever form it was preserved, obviously fewer texts than would have been available in the time of the Romans, but nonetheless there were some. And where did they come from? I mean, Petrarch came across some, but there are others. The Latin texts of the Western world were also preserved, the Ciceros and the Virgils and the Horaces, and they were preserved. Who did that?
Well, you can take the governance and management of the city of Rome itself as a kind of a benchmark for this. At its heights, estimates vary between the maximum population of Rome. I've heard as high as 1 million, but 800,000 is not an unusual figure to encounter for Rome at its height. And this is largely, these estimates are based on the importation records of foodstuffs and what have you for a
Yeah.
given period. We know that by the time we get to the early to mid 6th century, 525 to 550 or so, the population has dwindled down to something anywhere between 15,000 and 25,000.
Wow.
It's empty. It's empty. And the example I gave you earlier by Chrysostom is something which is very consistent across what had been the Roman Empire. We find in the ruins of these great cities, amongst the gigantic columns and huge temples and great paving stones, we find signs of crude little wooden huts set up amidst all this stuff. So it's gone. And the Romans can't even be bothered to govern this fallen little Rome, the city that is, in the lowest point here. And so by default, it falls over to the Pope, Pope Pelagius initially, and then Pope Gregory the Great. They begin running schools again. They begin maintenance of basic necessities, when it comes to drainage and sewage and stuff like that. They set up orphanages. They look into the management of churches and what have you. They start dealing with the importation of sufficient foodstuffs to keep the remaining inhabitants alive.
There's a shift here. I wanted to interrupt you here because a few years back I read a book by Peter Brown, the scholar of late antiquity that we've spoken of.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote something that just stunned me. And I don't think it's quite passed into popular culture yet, or even into the understanding of the academy. His claim is that, and part of this is well-known fact, early on the church was poor and they were oppressed. And with Constantine, they became the official religion of the Roman Empire, etc. And eventually the church became wealthy, and in some cases ostentatiously, fabulously wealthy, so much so that they became criticized for it. One of the takes on this is from probably the Protestant Reformation, partly responsible for this, that the Catholic Church was responsible for the Dark Ages. Because of the ostentatious wealth and the lack of Christian character in the popes they saw of their day, etc. And there's a disparagement of the wealth. But Brown's hypothesis, which he demonstrates to my mind quite well, is that in the wake of the destruction of the Roman Empire, which you just spoke of, the sacking, Christians came to the fore and used the wealth in order to disperse it and to give. So that Augustine spoke of a war on giving in 403 and dispersing the funds as a means of looking after people, as a part of the kingdom of God being lived out and so forth. Now, it was nothing like the previous classical age, obviously, and the culture was not preserved through that act. But nonetheless, that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
This is something which is not terribly controversial in students of what is known as the late antique period. The late antique period is this period at the very end of the Roman Empire, let's call it approximately 300, into what is later known anachronistically as the Dark Ages, so we'll say around 600. This notion that the church steps into the looming disaster, into the chaos, and imposes benevolently some degree of structure and normalcy
Like you
on
said
what
with
is happening.
Gregory the Great, right?
Yeah, it was, so for instance, when the Huns invade northern Italy, catastrophically, the Huns were unstoppable under Attila. And I think it's Pope Leo who actually is the person who goes out to negotiate the peace and the tribute. It's not a Roman emperor, it's not a Roman official, it's not anybody from the secular world. It's just assumed, okay, it's going to be some figure from within the church. Who's the loftiest guy we have in northern Italy? Well, it's Pope Leo. Get him out of Rome and get him up here because he's got to deal with this guy. And he did so successfully. But this is happening both at the macro level and the micro level, right across the shattered remnants of the Roman Empire. The church is stepping in, the church is stepping in, the church is stepping in. And so if anybody is managing society whatsoever, it's, as Peter Brown calls him, it's the holy man in whatever figure he is. Maybe he's a holy monk or hermit or something like this, or maybe he's a loftier figure like a pope or something like that, or maybe he's this bishop or that bishop. But the Dark Ages, if we're accepting that term, and there's many medievalists nowadays who reject that, the bottom line is it's holy figures from both within and without the church who are actually stepping into the gap that has been left, and it's a yawning gap.
Yeah.
And it's a time of great emergency. We have to remember here also that Europe at this time, and I might have mentioned this in the previous podcast, is continually under invasion. So it's not that it's breaking down just within. So
It's
it's
being plundered.
That's right. Its financial system is gone. Its management system is gone. The actual edifices are gone, but also it's being invaded from three different directions significantly. The east, of course, most catastrophically, we have the Huns. And while Attila is leading them, he's a charismatic leader, so they're unified by one man. And they are just a force that cannot be stopped. There is a battle. The battle is usually known as the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, somewhere around the 450s. And we know that its scale was simply off the charts for the time. And we know some of the great tribes who participated in it. And this was the end of Attila the Hun. But the bottom line is the empire was being destroyed from these invasions from east, and they will continue under the Magyars later on and so on. From the south, we have the Muslims coming up, and they drive up very successfully across the Roman Empire in northern Africa, destroying much of where Augustine himself had grown up and displacing the Christian population there by the sword. And then they drove up into Spain, and then they drove up seemingly unstoppably into southern France. And they were stopped finally in, it was 730 something at the Battle of Tours. And that was the end of their invasion. But the bottom line is, again, all the empire is being destroyed here. And Christendom, by the way, is being destroyed in these invasions to a large extent too. And then, of course, very famously in the late 8th century, around 790, we have the explosion of the Vikings out of the north. So they're being invaded from pretty well every direction they can be invaded from. So, and the destruction is off the charts. So along with the turmoil that comes from the breakdown within, you have this breakdown from without as well. And this is also burning the libraries and what have you. You asked who was preserving the texts, and to an overwhelming degree, it's the monasteries and the scriptoria. They know how valuable these texts are, and they are desperately hiding them away and reproducing them as fast
copying
as they
them,
can.
right? That's they don't have a printing press, so they are by hand copying them, illustrating them, etc.
That's right. And the work of actually producing one of these manuscripts is enormous and super specialized. This is a largely dying skill set. Remember, literacy is vanishing, never mind recording properly a great text from history. So again, the preservation of this culture is largely down to the churches and the monasteries and what have you, and just quietly, diligently doing the work that needed to be done. And then the next library would go up in flames in front of invasions or accident or what have you, and they'd start the process again. But they carried the lantern, as it were, of literature and culture, more generally speaking, through these dark ages.
You can correct me if I'm wrong on this. My understanding of this is that in the Latin West, it was largely the Latin texts that were being transmitted, repeated, preserved, such that they had no Plato or Aristotle really, and they only recovered that when the Muslim conquered, the Eastern Byzantine Empire, when they encountered them and then brought them Greek texts and the Greek philosophers and so forth, because in the East, in Eastern Christendom, it was the Greek texts that were being reproduced. So it was, and at that point, the formerly united Roman Empire was brought, and the Greek and the Roman were brought back together under our man Petrarch.
Yeah, Petrarch signals the way forward on a number of levels. As you noted, they recovered the Iliad finally from somewhere within the Balkans. I think it was indeed a Greek individual. And then somebody brought it to Italy, and then Petrarch picked it up from him. But this begins a wave of something we're going to talk about in much greater detail in later podcasts, and that's the rise of the humanists and exactly who those people were and what they were trying to do. Because they follow three distinct phases, in my opinion. And we don't have time to get into it here. But yeah, these were people who all of a sudden clued into the fact that there had been a vast, vast loss of culture, and that what little remained of it needed to be found and preserved quickly and accurately. And you have a number of these very, very famous individuals. Petrarch is, of course, one of the paramount figures. But you've got the Scaligers as well, and all these other individuals whose names now are largely forgotten.
I think Boccaccio as well.
Yeah, Boccaccio is another big one, the writer of the Decameron.
Mm-hmm.
And we will talk when we get to Beowulf also about one of the more famous humanists there, Robert Cotton.
So the contention, and it has been contended, and it's been contended since Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that the loss of culture was to be put at the feet of the Christians, that effectively Christian culture was, or rather classical civilization and its culture was destroyed by Christians. And a few incidents are used to demonstrate this thesis, one of them being the destruction of the library in Alexandria in 391 AD. Another, Justinian the Emperor closing the academy, Plato's Academy in Athens in 529. And so Gibbons regards Christian as an anti-intellectual movement. So he's giving his own take on what the Dark Ages entail. And recently, A.C. Grayling has picked up that banner and run with it, and making the claim that Christianity has from its beginnings been anti-intellectual, and therefore, if we're going to exercise our minds properly, we should avoid the anti-intellectualisms of the Christians. How do you speak back to that? I have my own answers here. I'm curious about you.
Yeah, Gibbons really gets this ball rolling, and it seems like every generation, another set of scholars comes up with this thesis as if it's the first time we've ever heard it. So it's a bit embarrassing. But Grayling, as you say, he's the latest iteration, but there is nothing new under the sun. I think that in certain ways, Christianity as a spiritual worldview was responsible for certain weakenings within the Roman Empire, but had other much more serious and catastrophic influences not come into place, it never would have, you would never have been able to level this charge at Christianity. We have much larger factors. Most people conclude, at least most historians I've read, conclude that the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire are almost impossibly complex, and that there are other things that press much more towards the front when it comes to laying blame for why it all went sideways. One of them is, that is perennially cited, is the loss of that particular Roman spirit of altruism in pietas, this notion of being publicly minded, and that you would sacrificially contribute talent, money, resources, time to the betterment of the res publica in general, and your civic setting around you more immediately. Even Romans like Polybius, for instance, in the 2nd century BC already is saying, look, we've got a growing problem here. Romans are becoming more and more self-centered and acquisitive and rapacious, And we're taking our eyes off the public realm and looking into private interests.
Yeah.
You see this also with the Roman army, which morphs dramatically in the late Roman period. Your average Roman considers military service in the later period to be kind of, for lack of a better word, icky and dangerous. And why would I do that? It's kind of beneath me. So the idea that you would actually sign up and become a legionnaire or anything like this is a notion that they would meet with a degree of ridicule on average. And we have actual accounts of this. And so where do you get these troops from? Increasingly, you get them from the barbarians against whom your empire rubs or who you've actually conquered. So there's large numbers first of Gauls and Iberians and what have you in the Roman legions, and then
So they're
massive.
conscripts and
Yeah, well, no, they find this notion attractive because if you're the Roman army becomes overwhelmingly Germanic in its later period. Even its generals are actually of Germanic extraction, Belisarius and people like this. They bring their own sensibilities to military life. And one of the features of Germanic military life is this code of loyalty, this ferocious code of loyalty to your immediate war leader. And in this case, it's their generals, the generals who are leading the legions. Are they loyal to Rome? No, they're not loyal to Rome. They're loyal to General so-and-so. And so if that general has ambitions, he has an immediate army of very, very loyal, and I might mention very ferocious followers who can back up his will. You see this even with the establishment of the Praetorian Guard. It was made law that the soldiers couldn't enter the city of Rome itself. So how does the emperor have a guard? So he establishes his own private guard. This is the Praetorian Guard. But the problem is Roman emperors are continually being assassinated by their own guards. So what's the number one feature they begin looking for? Loyalty. And so the Praetorian Guard very quickly is entirely made up of Germanic barbarians. They're dressed in Roman regalia and they follow Roman protocols. But we have writers even mocking the fact that the Praetorian Guard can't speak Latin. All they've got is their Germanic tongue, and getting them to do anything is almost impossible. And not only that, they're incredibly surly and dangerous, so just stay away from them. But they're all Germans. And so you see essentially the Roman military entirely taken up by these barbarians, taken over by these barbarians, soon run by these barbarians, and then the Roman army fragments into sometimes legions, sometimes individual cohorts or what it might be, but there's no central unity anymore. So when the Great Migration kicks off, usually our date is either 407 or 409 AD for that, when the Great Folkwanderung begins, the wandering of the people, the migration period. The army that they smash into is fragmented, disorganized, disloyal to wider concerns, and just is blown like chaff before them. It's just finished. So that's a contributing factor. You also have the decline of Roman paganism. Increasingly, it is something reserved for traditionalist, sort of sentimental Roman aristocratic elites. They're the last holdouts when it comes to paganism. And Gibbon makes something of this, actually.
Even he charts the decline in Roman virtue. So they have these austerity as a part of being a Roman in many ways, and chastity amongst the women. They're famed for these things, and increasingly they become indulgent, and so they indulge in these great festivals of consumption, and then they vomit out the things that they've just consumed in order to consume more. So it's just this excessive, immoderate, impious. So it's a decline of the Roman character, perhaps out of apathy, out of the lack of enemies, and then they grow fat, and that seems to me at least one hypothesis. And as you say, the emperors are being repeatedly assassinated long before the Christians come on the scene.
Yeah. So I mean, even in the Greek Hellenistic period, they realized that the best Greek thinkers realized that Greek religion had come to kind of a dead end and had devolved into kind of either arbitrary rite and ritual and so on and so forth, or more commonly, it devolved into, quote, mere philosophy. And you see this with the rise of Epicureanism and the rise of Stoicism and things like this. And you see those movements almost entirely take over late Roman thinking. This is what they're talking about. They're not talking about the usual sense of piety and obligations to the gods and things like this. It becomes a philosophical stance.
Yeah.
So famous Roman emperors like Marcus Aurelius become famous for this tendency here. So they're not religious men. They're philosophical men trying to live the good life according to a philosophical code, which is very, very different than a religious code.
It is, yeah.
We also know that Rome had been struggling against decadence and decay, especially in terms of culture, even from the time of Augustus. Augustus, one of his key concerns was to institute good old-fashioned Roman cultural norms and values. And he was successful in doing so. It's one of the reasons his age was known as the Golden Age. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, we see it take its natural course, and it dies out quite entirely. So we have all these things to consider as well. You mention, this culture of excess, and it was that. It was a massive culture of excess. You see the polarization of the way Romans did business. Rome was a farming culture initially. And so you'd have a Roman farmer, and he would have his plot of land and his wife and family on it. And it had sort of standard features. And then in war season, he would have to go off and fight in the wars and come back and do his thing. However, the wars went on. The farms were annexed. They were largely pulled into huge, what we would now call agribusiness. And we'd have farms no longer of 2-3 acres. We'd have farms of 15,000 hectares owned by one man. And what does he run it with? He runs it with slaves. This was one of the great demands for slave culture in the Roman period. They needed enormous numbers of slaves to run this new form of Roman civilization.
Which was eradicated by Christians, by the way, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the aspects of the Dark Ages, which sort of contradicts the thesis of a darkness, is the fact that slavery was abolished under the Christian Holy Roman Empire, and that's very interesting. It did not return until the rise of an anti-Christian enlightenment. That's when it really takes on legs again. At least that's a thesis that's been presented in recent years that I find rather persuasive.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Gibbons was very much a man of his period as well. It was somewhat fashionable, as you know, in the Enlightenment, to be an intellectual atheist and to be vaguely hostile to all things Christian. Probably the most famous figure there, of course, is Voltaire. But Gibbons was a part of an established group of intellectuals who would arrive to the object of study, in this case, the decline of the Roman Empire, with a preset thesis, in my view, and then would retroactively feed in the evidence to build up the case. So I think there's many ways in which you can overturn Gibbons' thesis that it was Christianity fundamentally at the core. I don't think this is a terribly well thought out piece of scholarship.
Not really, no, I don't. I think not either. So even on the matter of the sacking or the destruction of the Great Library in Alexandria, again, Peter Brown, the scholar of antiquity, he thinks that it's just part of the random mob violence that was taking place in the city, and they sacked the library and burnt it. And his evidence, that is A.C. Grayling's evidence that this was an anti-cultural impetus or anti-intellectualism, is that later Christian writers pointed to this as the triumph of Christianity over paganism. He's suggesting that that was the motive of those who burnt it. And that doesn't seem to be the case. At least Brown suggests it's not. That wasn't the motivation. It wasn't an anti-intellectualism that motivated it. It was they hated the pagans, etc. And there was a battle between them, and it was a blood feud, more or less. And then later writers suggested that the fact that the pagan temples had been destroyed was a sign of the triumph of Christianity. But their contention is arguable on that front, I would say.
I don't think there's any serious medievalist out there nowadays who would disagree with the statement that Christians were responsible for carrying the light of civilization and culture through the Dark Ages, the very destructive and violent Dark Ages. It was they who established schools. It was they who preserved the texts. It was they who carried on teaching learned traditions as best they could to the next generation. Time and again, this was the work of the church. So if anybody was maintaining intellectual endeavor throughout that 1,000-year period, it's the church. It's almost
in the East and West, right?
That's correct. And this is another thing I should mention just briefly in passing here. We tend to forget, we tend to talk a lot about how how Arabic culture preserved a large part of this cultural inheritance, its literature particularly, the Great Library of Damascus and stuff like that. And there is something to that. But we tend to also, in doing so,
but they were Greek monks.
Yes, but we tend to put too much emphasis on that. A lot of the great texts that were recovered, especially with the rise of the Renaissance, were recovered from the West and from Western monasteries.
From the East.
No, from the West as well. We just didn't know
Oh,
where to look, and
okay.
we didn't bother looking.
Really?
Um, yeah, and there were private archives that had survived. There were, I mean, when it came to humanist endeavor, they scrambled all over the place, and sometimes it would take them up into strange places in deserts, other times up into the Alps and what have you. And so they were recovering them from all over the place.
So it's like Indiana Jones in the Middle Ages.
It really rather was. And
Interesting.
then, yeah, and then the recovery of these texts and the rejuvenation of them, which is a separate endeavor, required an extremely systematic and scientific methodology. Known well, there's many different aspects to this, but paleography and codicology and all these sorts of things are part of it. And it was these thinkers and intellectuals who actually did the hard work of this recovery.
Hmm.
Now, having said that, people in the Middle Ages, both during the early Middle Ages, that is to say from approximately 400 up till about 1050, that's the early Middle Ages, or this is properly what we usually talk about as the Dark Age. Those individuals had texts and rumors of texts survive onto them, whereby they knew that they had lost something. This sense of loss becomes even more acute during the High Middle Ages, from about 1050 right up to about 1475, which is a very, as I said before, is a very different period than the early Middle Ages. The two big cultural features of the High Middle Ages are courtly love on the one hand, and codes of chivalry on the other. Those are non-existent in the early Middle Ages. So it's not like the great conversation died entirely, but during the Middle Ages, they were keenly aware that they were somehow carrying a very frail, guttering torch of cultural life. And somehow, through the violence and the ignorance and the darkness and the brutality of their age, they had to carry on and persist. And it's, as I said before, it's the church doing this work that's key to understanding. If you didn't have the church there, we would have completely and entirely lost Western culture.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, you know what? We went on far longer than I thought we would. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I expected that we would not get to Beowulf, but I was always hopeful. What are we going to talk about next then, Bill? I think we should probably wind this one down here.
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to be talking about Beowulf. I'm going to talk a little bit about, give an introduction to Beowulf, the text itself, its core components, its chief commentators, its sources, cultural factors that feed into it. We'll be talking about the monsters and their role thematically in there. We'll talk about why Beowulf is one of the greatest texts in Western civilization, something which was overlooked until somebody taught us how to actually read what was on the page in front of us. And we've not gone back since then. And we'll get into all that core content matter. We'll probably have to go on for a couple of episodes in order to give even a surface treatment to the text.
Okay.
But that's primarily what we're going to be getting into. So that's going to be episode 3 of season 2 for Paideia today. I should also make brief mention here that there are a number of platforms whereby you can actually listen to this. We are on iTunes, we are on Google Podcasts, we are on Spotify, we are on Anchor, and we are on Facebook as well. We have links to that additionally. And finally, we are putting videos of our podcasts up on YouTube. I believe there are 2 of them up there already. If you just type in Paideia today, as spelled with this, as in this podcast here, you will immediately get those links coming up. So I think that covers off everything we've got to talk about today. So that's me signing off. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.